Heritage Month empowerment session, where we bring together cannabis subject matter experts to help demystify subjects in the cannabis industry. My name is Antonio Valdez, co founder, executive director of the National Hispanic Cannabis Council, and I am honored to be here. I would like to say a few words first about the National Hispanic Cannabis Council and its mission. We are here to educate the U.S. Hispanic community on the health, wellness, and economic aspects of cannabis to empower their support and participation in the industry. Today, we're holding this webinar partly to highlight one of the most important issues facing cannabis companies and industry professionals today: cannabis compliance regulations. Cannabis compliance regulations can be complex, confusing, and time-consuming, but they are an instrumental part of running a successful cannabis business. But we do these guidelines entail, and how can cannabis professionals make sure they're covered all of their bases? Well, with me today is our expert guest to make sense of it all and to highlight why it is so crucial that you make sure to meet all your company demands. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce Rafael Bonato. He is the interim CEO and Chief Compliance Officer for Green Scientific Labs. Rafael has more than 15 years experience in compliance, quality assurance, and product safety experience, including the past 5 years in the medical cannabis industry. Hola, Rafael, and thank you for joining us today. And Rafael, please add anything additional to your background that I did not include.
Hi, Antonio. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the introduction. As you mentioned, yes, I have a little bit of experience in quality control, quality assurance, and compliance. I've devoted my professional career to product safety, mostly consumer goods.
Good, good, good. Rafael, today, before we jump in and talk about the compliance industry, I'd like to start with you and just ask you a couple questions. How did you get into the legal cannabis industry and why?
So let me it's an interesting story. I worked for a pharmaceutical company for about almost 5 years, and we successfully delivered on the application of 2 different products, 3 different strengths of each product. And we did such a good job that we put ourselves out of a job. So our projects were migrated somewhere else, and I decided to stay in South Florida. This was right about the time that medical cannabis just started in Florida. So I had a colleague that started working for a medical cannabis company back. It was called Modern Health Concepts. This was 2017. That kept contacting me about bringing my knowledge into that startup, and presented with that opportunity, I decided why not. My site was closing down, everyone was moving somewhere else, so I decided it would be a good time for me to explore a brand new industry and be what maybe consider maybe one of the pioneers down here in South Florida in the medicinal cannabis space. So that's how I started. It was a little bit of a push because our site was closing down, but definitely a step that I did not regret taking.
Well, I got to tell you, you really legitimize the industry. I mean, as we get more and more professionals like you, we become the playing field in the industry, as they say, becomes more legit.
Yes, my first day there, my first day during the interview, I met with the pharmacist. I met with the CEO. I spoke on the phone with the medical director. So to your point of legitimizing the industry, there's a lot of highly professional people working in this industry. Cannabis, in some states, it's a recreational product, but make no mistakes, the people that work in this industry, they're very professional. Everybody works very, very hard.
Oh, I can definitely validate with you on that. So yes, as we're talking about Hispanic Heritage Month this week,
Mhm.
and actually for the entire month, let me ask you this. I know you're from Brazil, but I still love to get your opinion. How do you think cannabis has been received by the Latino community?
I think it has been just like everywhere else in the world. There's a little bit of a stigma, and maybe some religions may be a part of that as well. But I believe that in recent years, a lot of those doors started to open, and those barriers started to come down. We have countries like Uruguay, where it's widely available. Brazil, where companies are allowed to consumers are allowed to import, from a BTC perspective, a business they can purchase from outside of the Brazil with authorization from their Anvisa, which is comparable to the FDA here in the US. And we have Mexico, Colombia. So doors are opening, and the industry is growing. There's actually a lot of work being done in Colombia. I've been in contact with a lot of people there, growers, processors, manufacturers, and even generating international business for Colombians as well.
Um, that's great, and I see the movement too. And I think once this becomes federal, I think this will open up more doors only because of the standardization around that. But let
Mhm.
me ask you this: I think you live in Miami, correct?
Correct, nearby Fort Lauderdale.
Okay, yeah, you're in South Florida. Let's talk about the domestic Latino, not the foreign, but the Latino that lives here in your backyard, the folks in your neighborhood. When you tell them, "Hey, this is what I do in cannabis," the reaction is it like, "Wow, you're a hero," or "Oh my gosh, the role of shame comes upon you." In
No,
terms,
yeah, I think it's more the hero. A lot of people um, they have plenty of questions, right? They want to know more about it, um, and a lot more than, for example, when I worked in pharma. They wanted to know maybe, oh, what is it that you do with cannabis? Is what is it that you do? What else is out there? Where do you see this industry going? So it's a very exciting subject. Honestly, people do want to know about it, and
and
very
Rafa, I guess Rafael, reason I ask, you're a doctor. You have
interesting.
high. Well, you know the science
Yes.
behind cannabis, and what I'm trying to, I guess, drive at is you, in the community's eyes, are a person of trusted advisor. You
Mhm.
are someone that, if it comes to ask a question about cannabis, you have confianza, as they say, trust.
Correct.
And I love it, again, because you're legitimizing what our mission is in general, that it's not a bad thing. It's a thing that, used in the right way for the right ailment, it can solve many solutions. It could be not the end solution, but it can be an interim. And
Mhm.
it can, again, bring happiness to many people in that respect. So
Correct.
that's why I was asking, in that respect. Let's get on with this now. As it relates to compliance, just to start, for anyone listening who isn't familiar with the compliance regulations, what do these entail in cannabis? That you think?
So the regulatory environment in cannabis is a little more complex than in other industries, whereas there's a little bit of federal regulation. When the hemp bill passed, so there's a little bit of regulation in that regard. However, every state has its own set of guidelines, restrictions, and regulations, which are constantly evolving as well. So, um, for example, for somebody who's getting into this industry, or getting to learn about how to start a business, what are my requirements? Uh, you're operating in an area where the rules and regulations are still taking shape. So don't expect it to be, these are the regulations, and that's how you run with it. There's a lot of changes and updates occurring. There's states that are trying different things, and other states are taking notice. So they'll observe and take lessons learned from a different state and update their regulations So for companies, especially companies that are multi-state operators that may do business in multiple states, it's I wouldn't say complicated, but challenging to maintain all of this, just because of the constant changes and the constant evolution of the regulatory environment of this industry.
I was on mute, Rafael. Sorry about that. And the question I asked was, you mentioned it is complicated, and it gets more complicated in cannabis than in other industries. And you're so right. Let me ask, what are some of the more sensitive or important compliance guidelines that you recommend?
That's a very tough question to answer, because when you're talking about regulations, every line, every sentence, and every word is important. You might be meeting 99% of your regulations and maybe fall short on one. That one could be cause trouble for the company. I think it's very important for the regulations to be looked at in its entirety. Not causing somebody to fall into the trap of like meeting most of it but not all. That happens sometimes, especially with regulations that are evolving. There's a lot of changes, and with those changes, something that was required is not required anymore, or something that was not required now is required. So it's hard to pinpoint which one would be the most important. There's regulations pretty much about everything, in this industry. From the time you acquire your raw material, that being a plant or a seed for the growers, or an extract for somebody who's a producer, tracking that material, by milligrams, by grams, all the way to your security system, your video system, your inventory tracking systems. Everything is very important. It's part of regulation, so it's very important that it's also being maintained and accurate at all times. Training of personnel, the quality assurance behind it, documentation. As I mentioned, it's a very highly regulated industry. So I would say that all of the regulations are important.
Gotcha. It sounds like you need your own proper documentation just to be in accordance.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask this: what have you seen as the repercussions for companies that don't meet their compliance demands? Is it mainly fines and possible loss of license, or are there real safety issues at play as well?
It's a highly regulated industry for a reason. Non-compliance in this industry, depending on which area the industry you operate in, may generate severe consequences, like as simple as a business disruption where you may not be able to operate a particular process for some time, to financial losses that generates, of course. Then you have erosion of customer trust, damage your reputation, and then of course the more financially impactful ones, which may be fines and license revocations.
Gotcha. What do most companies do to manage these tasks? Is there a particular methodology? I mean, coming into the cannabis industry, what would you recommend how to manage these complexities and these tasks?
So I guess I can just talk about how I started.
Perfect.
Basically,
That would be a great.
Okay. What I did when I started, I pretty much just had the regulation set up in front of me, and I created a matrix that had every single line, sentence within that regulation, and I made sure that I had something to check every single box next to it. Very long, tedious job, taught me a lot, mostly because also These regulations are written in a legal language. So there may be some interpretation or referring back to definitions that sometimes causes confusion. So it's important to also, if there is a question, reach out to a regulator, try to clarify as much as you possibly can before you implement a system where maybe your interpretation was not the same interpretation as the regulators. And as I mentioned, with this ever-changing regulations, it's hard to manage. So having some type of a compliance tool or something that you're able to rely on to, even if it's something that's just giving you updates or highlighting a particular section or procedure that may be affected because of a change in regulation is very, very helpful.
So, Rafael, are there products today off the shelf that help people entering the cannabis industry to manage these tasks today?
Um, it depends, right? There's a few products that are helpful. Rootwurks is coming up with a product that's going to be helpful. In managing the audits, managing the regulation, ensuring people are trained on it. But it does require, for the staff to be very, very vigilant and alert about these changes and understanding how these changes impact their processes. It's a very hard thing to rely 100% on a tool, just because something off the shelf might not be tailored exactly to your operations. So maybe a product that has some type of modular or some type of custom aspects to it that may be able to tailor that to your operation. It's definitely something that I would look into and go with.
Gotcha. It also sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a dedicated compliance professional on staff or somewhere that you can lease, not lease in the way you do a product, but in terms of a service that you hire or look for a dedicated service that can help you with the compliance needs. Does that sound like a solid recommendation?
Yes, there are consultants out there, people that specialize in compliance. There's also a lot of law firms that might provide that service, which is something that most often, a startup company or a small business will rely on. But as companies grow and they have a little bit more need and more staff, the companies tend to hire somebody usually in the beginning that would handle quality and compliance, and then eventually split up those two roles. That's what I see happening in the industry most often.
Gotcha. Thank you. And what about digital compliance tools? Can they help?
Oh, absolutely. There's in this particular industry, just because almost everything that we do is regulated, if not everything, we have compliance tools to help track cannabis inventory, compliance tools to help us manage training, investigations, audits, inspections, track and trend complaints. So there's a lot of tools out there that are very good in assisting, at least in assisting, the companies get what they need to get accomplished.
At NHCC, we cater to constituents that are Latino entrepreneurs in the cannabis economy. What advice would you have for small companies that are in the cannabis space that might be understaffed and have more trouble juggling the compliance demands? I know this is a priority, but what advice would you give them?
Just like, compliance and quality go hand in hand in that regard, that I believe that it's everyone's responsibility. So with the small team, you often have people wearing a lot of different hats. So understanding at least their section of the regulations and how it affects their day to day, And then once that's mastered, then trying to understand and learn how it affects the product downstream, the product upstream, and also your clients. What that would do is give each one of those employees a much broader vision of what their compliance impacts. And basically, what you're doing is you're sharing the workload, you're sharing the bandwidth needed to maintain compliance. So maybe production is taking on a little bit, um, operations is taking into a little bit, sales and marketing is taking into a little bit, which allows not one person to be fully dedicated to this.
Gotcha. And I think for our final question here, what are the key steps to take when implementing a compliance plan at a cannabis business? What would you recommend?
Like I previously mentioned, I believe that having the regulations in front of you and going line by line, preferably with your team, just to get a better understanding and perception of what the interpretation of these rules and regulations will be for your specific business. And I like to say that because every business is different.
Yeah.
And regulations tend to be written in a general way, which would apply to almost any case, and gives you some flexibility and allows for a little bit of creativity in how you're going to set up your processes. So it's very important to have those, at least the most important stakeholders and decision makers being part of this process. Once everybody understands collectively what the regulation means for that particular process, I think better decisions can be made into how address the company specific process to meet the regulation.
Gotcha.
And I say that because in this industry, companies, laboratories, dispensaries, we get audited. And when that happens, the regulators come in and they'll say, I observe you doing this. The regulation says this. What do you? How do you explain this? So you should also always be able to explain why are you doing what you're doing and maybe not something different. And because every business is different, sometimes you may have to do something a little bit different.
Gotcha. But it still seems that policies and procedures, culture, very important here because the key stakeholders, which seems to be everyone in the organization, needs to be aware.
Correct.
So, Rafael, do you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity. It has been a pleasure. I love to be able to share experiences and especially give information to companies and people who are interested about cannabis industry and want to maybe start. There's a lot of people who sometimes watch these webinars and they want to learn about a different aspect of the industry as well, maybe for a new career path or just to learn in general. So it's always exciting and rewarding to participate.
No, thank you. I wanted to say, Rafael, it was awesome. Thank you for being with us and really sharing your insights on this important topic in cannabis. And thank you for listening. This concludes our session. For more information, you can either visit me or the at nhcc.org, or you can reach Rafael here as well. Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you, Antonio.
I think that's it.